So I am Levi Hord. I'm in my fourth and final year in the Arts and Humanities here at Western. So as the introduction stated, I've worked at Woodland Cemetery for 3 years now, almost my entire undergraduate career. I've been very lucky to have a job to help fund my school, and B, one of the coolest jobs that I think a student can have in this city. So Woodland Cemetery, yes, it's the deer cemetery. When we do walking tours, they often turn into petting zoo walking tours, despite our efforts to focus on history. So I did prepare this presentation in regards to Remembrance Day. So part of the presentation is going to be talking about soldiers who fought in the First World War that are both memorialized at Woodland Cemetery and have some connection to Western University, as all of us here do. But I wanted to start off with a little bit about how I got into this job and this position and this interest in history, because my major is actually in women's studies and feminist research. I do philosophy of gender. So it's not really something that you see working together a lot. So first of all, the reason why I'm standing here is because of the School for Advanced Studies in Arts and Humanities. It's sort of our flagship arts program here at Western. Some of you might recognize that guy. He runs the concert series that happens in Weldon Library, has for the past few years. And SASA, it's an interdisciplinary program. We have small cohorts of 25 students per year, and we try to put different disciplines in arts and humanities in conversation with one another. So each of us students has a separate major, and then we bring all of the knowledge that we're getting from, for instance, my major in feminist research, somebody else's major in history, someone else's in creative writing, someone's in chemistry. And we make those all work together in order to push the arts and humanities further than they're currently being pushed in a lot of universities, and Western's great for that. But something that they also wanted to teach us was practical skills, how to introduce our theoretical knowledge in the arts and humanities into the real world. And so when I was in first year, back in 2014, my first year professor, Lawrence Deleuze, some of you may know him, he decided that he wanted to teach us the skill of archival and historical research. So what he did was he rode his bike down to Woodland Cemetery along London's beautiful bike paths, and he took his camera and he took photographs of 15 gravestones that predated the year 1900. And he brought them back to class, and he assigned us each a gravestone and said, find out everything you can about this family and tell their story in some sort of creative way. And so that was what really started this project. And so my family, they were the Boyds, they were Irish immigrants. I know their whole story. I decided to tell it through poetry. And when we'd all finished our projects, we brought them back to Woodland Cemetery, and the manager who worked there at the time, Paul Culleton, said, this is something that we need to see happening on a continual basis. We have brilliant archives at Woodland. We have rooms full of handwritten records dating back to the 1830s. If we could have students like this telling these stories to London as a community, we'd be doing something really special and unique. So, I was hired in December of 2014. Unfortunately, I do get to do the boring stuff during the year. I do data entry, super exciting. I also work reception. As some of you know, I've seen some of you there at the reception desk. I have the honor of helping families who've recently lost someone through that process. And that's most of the people who walk through our doors. But in the summer, we get grants, luckily, from the federal government to conduct historical research. Originally, this was just me doing this, and we've grown the program over the years to include several students from Western who are interested in doing this sort of as their full-time job, from the public history program, as well as other SASA students. So, I'm a lifelong Londoner. I grew up here. I grew up in Byron and Old South. And that being said, I'm only 21 years old. So I know, and I've encountered several local historians in their own right, as I've been researching these past 3 years, that know so much about London's history just by virtue of having been here for decades. And I know that we probably have several people in this room about whom I could say the same. So in the question period, I I beg you to share your stories if you have them related to this content. That would be amazing. So anyway, we hit the ground running in 2014. We started offering walking tours. We started researching the Victoria Day disaster, Victorian mourning customs, everything like that. Our cemetery opened in 1897. So it's definitely not the oldest cemetery in London, but we are the oldest, largest cemetery in London. Mount Pleasant come in a close second. And as I said, there's more history there than I will ever hope to uncover in my lifetime. As some of you may know, some of London's most famous citizens are buried there. We have most of the Labatt family, we have the Scatchards, we have the Hunt family, started London life, people like this. And so we've got our work cut out for us, basically. But as we approach Remembrance Day, and especially as we are currently in the centennial of the First World War, we decided in the summer of 2016 that we wanted to do something to commemorate Londoners who had served and who had some connection to Woodland Cemetery. And pretty immediately this posed a problem for us, because Woodland only keeps records on those who we have buried in our cemetery, obviously. And most of the people who served in the First World War from London, most of them were killed overseas. And at that point, there was no repatriation of bodies. If you were buried where you fell, and most Londoners who served were buried in Belgium or in France. So if we were to go to our archives or our records, we really have no record of these people or who they may have been. But we started noticing as we walked around the sections that date around this time period, the early 20th century, that we were actually seeing inscriptions and even whole gravestones like the one pictured there that were dedicated to soldiers, London soldiers who had served, and nurses, but who weren't buried there. That's why we ended up calling the tour They Are Not Here, because most of them, they're not here, but they are, because their families back in the early 20th century decided that they wanted to have somewhere concrete to put a memorial to these people that they could come back and visit anytime they wanted and have some place real to go and relive those memories of the people that they lost. So we started looking in earnest for these stones, and we ended up finding over 60 of them scattered throughout the cemetery when we really started looking. So what we did was we put all those names in a list, and we started researching. We researched every single soldier, through government archives, through city archives, through local historians, through family members who knew their stories. And then we put sort of the most compelling or interesting stories together in a little walking tour. The soldiers who were connected to Western, they were some of the easiest ones to find out about because of the work that Western has done in preserving those archives. So I'll show you a picture later in the presentation, but we could just walk into the Western Archives in Meldon Library and find a wealth of information on these people simply because they had gone to Western or they had some connection. So I think that bodes well for all of us one day in the future. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to tell you the stories of 4 soldiers who are connected to Western. If we have time later, or if the question period is really slow, I always have more stories in my back pocket that I can pull out. But these are some of the most interesting ones that I thought you would enjoy. So the first is about the Becher family. There's still a Becher Street in London. Their house, Thornwood, at 329 St. George Street, it still stands. You can still go drive by it. And so Henry and Catherine Becher, they were sort of the mother and father of the boys I'm going to be talking about. Henry was a barrister in London. He was also the mayor of London for a time, so this was a well-known family, and most people in London knew their name. The couple had 3 sons. The eldest, Henry Campbell, the middle, Alexander Lorne, and then Archibald Valency was the youngest. And so, look at me forgetting names. Alexander, the middle child, he was chronically ill in his youth. He had a lot of health problems, and we think that may be the reason why, when the First World War rolled around, he decided or couldn't enlist. But both Henry and Archibald decided to serve. Henry was the eldest child, and being the eldest son of a family like the Beechers, you had a lot of pressure on you. And Henry had trouble, we think, finding his place in London. He did study to become a lawyer, barrister like his father. He practiced law for a few years, but it never really fit with him. He decided to pursue a different career. He went into stock brokerage, still wasn't his forte. He was well known throughout London. He loved amateur acting. You could walk into any amateur theater and probably see him in a leading role. He loved the outdoors. He loved horses, cross-country riding. He loved playing cricket, any sport that you could imagine. And he loved nature. And almost all of his letters back home from the time that he served in the war were about how beautiful the flowers were in France. So most people agreed at this time that what he loved most was his family, his home, and his mother. But when the First World War rolled around, he decided that his sense of duty to his country was stronger than that, and he decided to enlist. He was actually one of the first men in London to do so, and he was immediately appointed to a very high-ranking position in Canada's 1st Battalion, which befit his status in the City of London. Everything changes for him when, on June 15th, 1915, the Becher family gets word that Henry has been killed in action. The story that reaches the family tells that Henry was standing on a parapet leading his men in a charge when a bomb goes off and shatters both of his legs. This isn't initially a life-threatening injury. They actually think that he's probably going to make it. They get a field ambulance out to him. They have 2 men carrying him on a stretcher back to safety when a German sniper takes out both of the men carrying the stretcher and shoots Henry through the neck. This is also not considered a life-threatening injury for reasons that I'm not exactly clear on. In any case, he is transported back to safety and they expect him to live. They think he's going to be fine. He does live for several hours, and everyone who's with him testify to his good cheer right up until the final moment that he was trying to make sure everyone around him was okay rather than himself. This was one of the first deaths that London as a community experienced of a very well-known young man from the city. And it was seen as sort of the ultimate sacrifice that a Londoner could make, especially since Henry knew the danger he was going into before he went in. His death is widely reported in the newspapers, and many people, soldiers who were with him, say that his last words were, "No man can live in that fire, but I'll go." The Becher family contacts the military, see if they might be willing to send his body back to Canada to be buried, but it's too late. By the morning after his death, he's already been buried with full military honors in a cemetery in France. Oops, sorry. So they decide instead to hold a memorial service at St. Paul's Cathedral, which was their church. And so many people attend that it's standing room only. The cathedral is absolutely packed. Archibald had a bit of a clearer path in life. You might say he was sort of the golden child of the family. He's our connection to Western here. He studied at Western's medical school, but he left halfway through his education to enlist in the Boer War in South Africa at the turn of the century. He also served as a city alderman for a time. He was London's coroner, which sounds like sort of an icky job, but back then it was one of the highest sort of standings you could hold as a medical professional in the city. And he has a list of achievements. They held a ball for him when he got back from South Africa. Everyone knew this guy as well. And so his personal friends included Winston Churchill, back in England, William Makepeace Thackeray, and Charles Dickens, so he moved in those sort of circles. And we think the reason he didn't enlist as early as Henry was because he had a young family at the time. He'd recently married Flora Dean Wilson in 1913, and the couple had a son a year later named John, who is in those pictures. Pretty cute, I think. Anyway, we think that it was probably Henry's death that prompted him finally to enlist. We're not sure whether it was pain, guilt, or wanting to pay honor to his brother's memory, the reason for him doing this, but we do know that his services as a surgeon were sorely needed. So he enlists in October 1915, and he's immediately appointed as a surgeon major, and he leaves for Quebec to do some training before his final destination in France. He's only there for 1 month before he contracts double pneumonia, He continues caring for his patients up until he can no longer. He admits himself to the hospital. Unfortunately, because he was still in Canada at the time, his wife and his mother were able to travel down to Quebec to be with him. He passed away on Christmas Day, 1915. He was 36 years old. A month prior, he had actually signed his own medical release form stating that he was healthy and fit for active service. He didn't have any other doctor check him out. He was expert enough. He left behind a 2-year-old son, and likely unbeknownst to him, another son on the way. Because he died in Quebec, his body was able to be transported back to London for burial, and he was buried in the Becher family plot in Woodland Cemetery. The funeral was attended by thousands. The flowers for the service alone filled 4 carriages. Obviously, the Becher family was devastated by the loss of 2 sons and all of their potential. And in honor of them, they erected a double plaque commemorating both of the brothers in St. Paul's Cathedral, which still hangs there today. If you look closely at the walls, you'll see a lot of these soldiers that we're talking about memorialized at St. Paul's. And these are some of the photographs of Henry's gravestones from France. Archibald's gravestone is in Woodland Cemetery, his veteran stone, as well as one that the family specifically designed for him. And then they also made a stone for Henry to put in Woodland as well, beside his brothers, so that they could keep all of the family memories together in one place. Something that was interesting for me when I was researching this family was I figured out that I'm very, very, very distantly related to them. My grandfather, before he passed away, we did our family genealogy together, and we traced a paternal line back to William Makepeace Thackeray, who was the author of Vanity Fair, as some of you might know. And it turns out, as I dug a little deeper into this story, that not only was Archibald a friend of Thackeray, but they were actually first cousins, as was my ancestor. So even if it's not a very strong tie, it did tie me to this story in a more personal way, and allowed me to see these people not just as soldiers, but as related to me, at least in a common history. The next soldier we're going to be talking about was Henry Ardagh Kingsmill, also known as Harry, and yes, he was part of the Kingsmill family in London who started the dry goods store back in the 1830s, 40s, immigrated from Ireland, and he was born a day after Confederation, so he was a Confederation baby, July 2nd, 1867. And when he was a teenager, he helped out in the family store, he ran the cash, and he also was... Oh, I have more pictures than I realized. Sorry about that. He enlisted pretty early on in London's militia, the 1st Hussars. He just wanted to have that military aspect to his life. And he did attend Western's medical school. I love this photo. I got it from the Western Archives. An 1882, around 1882 shot of what the medical school looked like back then. He graduated from Western in 1895, so a little bit before most of us. Just a little. And he actually had a career as a physician and a surgeon in both Canada and England. So he would travel back and forth, and he had practices in both places. Interesting fact, his father, Thomas Fraser Kingsmill, the original Kingsmill, he also had business in both Canada and England. When we were researching for our Confederation tour, we used him as an example of a Victorian scandal, because it turned out not only did he travel back and forth to buy cloth from England, but he also had a wife in England and a wife in Canada. Yeah. As far as we know, Henry did not have a wife in both locations, but you never know. We do know that he did marry a woman, Inez Ethelyn Smith, who was described as a blonde American singer. The two had 2 children, Sydney, their son, and Eleanor, their daughter, and the whole family's actually buried together at Woodland, which tells us that Henry wasn't killed overseas. He actually made it back. He enlisted really late in the war. We think this may have been because he was a bit older than most of the people who were serving. He was in his 50s at the time that he enlisted, or just about in his 50s. And he enlists in April of 1918, so he only ends up serving for 7 months. He serves in the medical corps as a surgeon, and obviously his His skills are sorely needed overseas. When he returns, he's already fallen victim to the soldiers' flu epidemic. It's something that he's never really able to shake. He ends up passing away in February of 1920 from pneumonia caused by the flu. He lives out the last of his days in sickness, but he is able to be with his family, which was important to him. So this is their plot. We have many Kingsmill plots at Woodland, but this is the plot for this family in particular. And because his body is actually buried there, this allows for his veteran stone to be placed on that lot as well, right beside the family stone. And as you can see, there are still members of the Kingsmill family who come back and visit the grave and place mementos there, like the Canadian flag that you can see. The next soldier I'm going to talk about, this one sort of really hit me to research, not least of all because I literally spent days transcribing his handwritten diary and all of his letters, but because we grew up in the same area, which was Byron. And so Cuthbert Finney McEwen, he grew up in Byron, which back then was not a part of London, but it's close enough, on the city's most famous sheep farm. And he was trained by his father, Robert, in the ways of farming. This was his intended career path. This is what he really loved to do. He traveled southwestern Ontario competing in all sorts of agricultural fairs, including the Western Fair. And he went to the Ontario Agricultural College and got his degree. But when the war is declared, he does end up enlisting in 1915, and he travels overseas to France in June. And due to his expertise with farm animals and with horses, he's transferred while there to the Canadian Light Horse Infantry. They need a soldier who's not only capable, but knows his stuff in terms of being able to take care of the animals, making sure they're well fed, well groomed, healthy, they're up to date on all their medical stuff, so they thought he'd be a pretty good fit for this. And he was. Something that we love about telling this story is that he decided to document the war while he was over there. He photographed or had photographed his regiment's travels all through the countryside, no matter what they were doing. I think the photo on the left there, they're having a haircut. And then on the right, they're resting. You can see the horses behind them. And so all of these photos, along with his letters and journals, were donated to the Western Archives, along with all of the other McEwen family information. We're not exactly sure what the connection was to Western, but the family has probably 5 or 6 massive boxes of family history that are just located in the archives, and if you take the time to go through them all, there's amazing stories in there, and that's where we found all of this material. So, as I said, I translated all these handwritten letters, and a member of the McEwen family back in the 1980s, I think, was nice enough to type some of them up on a typewriter, so that helped. But these really tell us a lot about his thoughts and feelings during the war, which is something that we don't get with a lot of other soldiers' stories. It's a rare sort of find. So I took 2 small parts out of his letters, and I'll read them just in case anybody can't see. The first one is to his older brother, who he called Bobs. It says, "Dear Bobs, it has been nice and warm for a week now, and it sort of gives me the pip or willies, or whatever you call that listless trouble. My dejected state is also increased by a very quiet day here on the job. From my point of view today, this war is proving a failure. Our duty is one of waste in the largest sense, waste of men, animals, and supplies. The nation that can stand the waste the longest will win the war." The second is to a cousin of his on his mother's side, who he refers to as Mrs. Rain. The 2 were close in age, they were good friends, and they would often travel together. And to her, he says, "Dear Mrs. Rain, for the combatant troops, it has been pretty much a case of life and death, and I'm sorry that for so many it has been the latter. But there have been many humorous happenings through it all. Some of the funniest things I have ever seen happen have been under conditions where you would least expect them. But if the Germans ever kicked the laugh out of our men, there would then be some doubt as to the way the war would finish." So he's surprisingly observant and deep. And I wish that I'd had time to include more of his letters, because it tells you a lot about the psychological state of someone who was going through this. He served for 3 years. He did have some leave. He traveled to places like Scotland to visit family, but most of the time he was near the front. He was in the thick of things. And so sometimes his letters would be 10 pages of just recounting a single memory of winning a gold medal at the Western Fair for one of his sheep. And at the end of the letter, he says, I know this isn't the news that you want to hear. I know that you want to hear how the war is going. I know you want to hear about how I'm doing, but right now, I need the time to think back on the good things. And this is the only time I have to do that. In other letters, it reveals his compassion that he feels towards the animals that he's working with. His service coincides with the first couple times that the Germans started using mustard gas in the field. And so one of his tasks was to figure out how to save the horses, because they had no way of defending themselves. They didn't know what was happening. And he is writing a letter home explaining how he's trying to put gas masks on these horses, and they keep bucking them. They don't want to wear them. And he says, what a cowardly way to fight a war. Like, you are killing innocent animals. They have no idea that simply by breathing, they're killing themselves. And he has real ethical dilemmas with the way that the war is being fought, and he's not shy about that. And most of those letters make it home, which is something incredibly rare to find. So during his time overseas, he makes a couple of interesting friends. One of them is Lieutenant Colonel Woodman Leonard, who was a pretty illustrious Londoner, and he fought at Vimy Ridge. And Western's public history program, master's program, actually wrote a book about him a few years ago, sort of spearheaded by Professor Michelle Hamilton, which is, I think, for sale in chapters. I saw it there, and it's an amazing account if you're interested in this sort of thing. He also made friends with Billy Bishop, a name that most of you might know. He referred to him in his letters home as Bish. That was his nickname. And he was Canada's top flying ace, Victoria Cross recipient, and it's interesting to read Cuthbert's letters about Billy Bishop because he says, this man's never going to make it through the war. He's being reckless, he's taking his life in his hands. I can't believe that a man who recently got married would take that kind of risky behavior. He's never going to make it home to his wife, to his family. And of course, he did, and Cuthbert didn't. In October of 1918, both Cuthbert and his family feel confident that he's going to make it home. He's served for over 3 years of active service, and he books off a week of leave, and he plans on traveling to England just for a little downtime. And before he leaves, his superior asks him to go on one last patrol of the front line. He goes on his horse, but the ground gets too muddy, so he decides to hop off his horse and proceed on foot. And as he gets close to the front line, he's struck by a shell fragment, and he dies 10 minutes later on patrol duty, October 21st, 1918. He's 29 years old, and it is only 2 weeks before the end of the war. After his death, McEwen's awarded the Distinguished Service Order for gallant and distinguished service in the field, and all of his belongings, including the journal that you see in that picture, were all returned to his family, and his death was extensively covered in the London press. His family, especially his father, they were heartbroken. The letters that they wrote afterwards to each other are probably some of the most difficult letters to read because they were deeply in grief. They knew that they couldn't get him back home, but his father wrote to his regiment and he said, "Can you just take a picture of his grave and send it home to me? I just want to see it." And so that's the photo that's up there on the left. They granted that request, but it wasn't enough for the family. And Woodland being fairly close to Byron, they decided that they wanted to have some place where they could come and be with him or be with his memories. Even though they couldn't be with him again, they wanted to have that sort of closure. And so they erected this stone. It's actually huge, and it's just for him. Cost them a fair bit of money, but it was that important to them. There's no other members of the McEwen family buried at Woodland, so this was just something that they wanted to do to remember their son. So, as a historical researcher and being a humanities student, we're very aware that it's often the facts that make the story. The more facts we have, especially in cases like Cuthbert's, the better story that we're able to tell, because we get a better sense of who they were as people. But it's also our job as historians and as humanitarians to pick up the drop stitches that are often left in histories, especially histories spanning back now 100 years. So something that I've learned, especially being a SASA student, being a humanities student, is how to tell a story based on archival facts that can often seem a little dry. And a big part of that has been recognizing the humanity in people that are across a gulf of history. A lot of the time, I think, and you might agree with me here, my generation has a hard time relating to history the way that we often tell it. It's often seen as a generational thing, or something that you get into as you get older and you get a better sense of your place in the world. And that was really something that, as we developed our program at Woodland, we decided that we wanted to combat. We wanted to make sure that, because these are important stories, these are incredible Londoners, and we wanted to make sure that their story was resonating in a key that would matter to people of all ages. And I think it tells us a lot about our own society, the way that we frame these stories, our own thinking about war, about conflict, about death, and especially about who does the emotional labor of remembering these stories as the world continues to age. And so the process, obviously, is made possible by the archives and the work that historians that came before us have already done. And Western has been a big part of this. The Archives and Research Collection Center, as well as the Rare Book Library, they have more information than any of us collectively has time to go through. But they do the work of sorting it, making it accessible to students who want to go in and tell these stories. Same thing with the London Room. They index our history so that at any point in time, anyone who grows up in London, even 100 years from now, can look back on us or look back on them and be able to trace that thread. So that's incredibly important to me, and it wasn't something that was important to me when I started going to Western. I grew up here. I thought I knew a lot about the history. I really couldn't care less about uncovering it, but now I definitely do. And so I have no idea how I'm doing for time, but okay. I just want to go, I'm still good. Awesome, cool. I want to go through a little bit of the other work that we do at Woodland. This project, the Soldiers, has only been one out of many projects that we've been able to do, and I honestly think they're amazing, so I want to share those with you too. First of all, we work a lot with student groups. As you can see in this picture, we decided early on that we wanted to bring in grade 7, 8, middle schoolers, high schools, even university students, programs like thanatology at King's, who study death and dying, as well as public history and history classes here at Western. But especially for the younger kids, and especially around Remembrance Day, we think this is an important way to make history tangible for them, make it something that they can actually grasp. I know when I was 7 years old and I was sitting in my Remembrance Day assembly, when we had our moment of silence, when you closed your eyes, I didn't know what to think of. I really had no connection to any of it. And so what we do for these students is we try to find, depending on what school they come from, so for instance, Tecumseh Public School, which is in the area where I grew up, or South, or London Central, where I went to high school, we said, you have a plaque in your school that tells you all the people who served. Give us the names from the plaque. We'll see who we have memorialized at Woodland. We put them together. You do your research on these people, we do ours, and then you get to come see their gravestone. Come see the physical remainder of this person, and we construct that history together. And so my hope, especially, is that younger kids who have trouble grasping things like this will go back to their Remembrance Day assemblies and think about people like Cuthbert McEwen, think about people like the Becher brothers, and that it might resonate with them more to put a human face on things like massive wars like this. And so I'll move on to this. This is one of my favorite things that we do. About 3 years ago, we started a monument restoration program, and I think this is sort of the digging up history component that's most interesting here. We have monuments dating back to when the cemetery opened in the 1890s, but also before that. There was St. Paul's Cemetery, which was the precursor to us, and then the churchyard burial ground at St. Paul's Cathedral, the Anglican Cathedral, and most of those stones were moved over at some point to Woodland. And unfortunately, when they're moved over and when they're that old, they'll fall over, they'll crack, they'll get washed away by the rain, they'll get weathered down, they'll get buried under snow, under grass. And so, as you can see in the before picture, some of our sections of our cemetery looked like that, and they're not supposed to. The monuments were just buried in the ground, and so early on, there's one man in all of southwestern Ontario who does this sort of restoration work with Victorian monuments. So we bring him in every summer, and we have a team of 3 to 4 students. So far, they've all been Western students, one of them from the Faculty of Education, in fact. And we teach them, we train them how to do this delicate restoration work. So in this photo, and these are just old Victorian monuments in a section, they were mostly for children. We dug them up, we built cement keys to put them back into. We cleaned them off with a special chemical solution that they use in Arlington National Cemetery for the veteran stones. And we made sure that they were readable, and that for those genealogists and people searching for their history that walk through our cemetery, this would be something that you could actually see rather than something that was lost to the ground or completely unreadable. This was you might have read about this in the papers. We got quite a bit of press coverage for this particular project. Sometimes this sort of work leads to us discovering a whole cemetery within our cemetery. And that's what happened to us this summer when we were working on Confederation-era projects for Canada 150. We found a covered stone that was covered over in grass and thought, oh, this seems like a small stone. It'll be a good practice stone for our upcoming monument students. So we tried to pull it out of the ground, find some room around it, and there was no room around it because there was another stone next to it, and another stone next to that, and another stone next to that, and so on until we found a line of 140 gravestones that were completely covered with grass. We had no idea they were there. And so it took us about 2 months. We brought up every one of those stones, and by tracing the names on the gravestones and the years and everything like that, we traced them back to St. Andrew's Parish. It was it still is, a Presbyterian church on St. James Street in London. And in 1950, their churchyard cemetery is getting kind of run down. So the city and the church agreed that they would purchase a plot at Woodland Cemetery and move all of the remains, as well as all of the gravestones, over to our cemetery. And at that point, whoever was managing the cemetery didn't care about preserving the history and just laid all these stones in a line along the fence line at the back of the cemetery. And the weight of them over the years, over the 67 years they were there, they sunk down. And so we uncovered them. And along with uncovering the physical stones, we were able to uncover the stories of these Scottish immigrants who mostly came to Canada in the 1830s and 40s and lived through the era when Canada was being built up as a nation. So it was incredible for us to be able to tell stories that were literally completely buried and lost only 2 months before. We also do walking tours. We run about 1 public tour per year. We've done tours on the Victoria Day disaster, which was the 1881 steamship crash in the Thames River. We have 52 of the victims in Woodland. We've done the Confederation tour that we did this summer. We've done tours on the First World War tour that we've done with actual historical reenactors, which has been really fun and a great way to engage our community. And our hope is that people who are genuinely interested will come out and experience history in this way with us. And it's pretty incredible, sort of the mix of people that we get. And as I mentioned, we also do school tours and university tours, and it's really important to us also to bring this history to people who can't necessarily come walk through the cemetery for an hour and a half, so we make mobile tours, and we take them out to nursing homes and things like that. And if you're interested in this more, we have the 3 documentaries, video documentaries that I made over the past 3 summers. They're all up on our website. Just search Woodland Cemetery in Google. And we actually have about 7 brochures now that I've made over the past couple of summers that are self-guided walking tours. So if you want to head out to the cemetery one day, just come into our lobby, pick up a brochure, and walk around the old historical sections and learn a little bit about the history of the Londoners who are there. And of course, going back to my roots, I still run the Gravestone Project for the first year SASA students. I work closely with Lawrence, who is my first year professor, and every year we try to give those students something different that we've discovered at Woodlands. So in the past that's been soldiers, as you see in this one, and the way that the students choose to tell these stories is pretty incredible. These students chose to make a Facebook profile for their soldier, Charles. So you can actually go and add Charles on Facebook, and you can see all of his pictures. He had a lot of pictures from his regiment. They made up statuses for him based on the way that he felt about the war. And so they created this thing that you can actually interact with as you would interact with a person in the 21st century, which is really cool. Other people have done videos, puzzles, they've reconstructed letters, just amazing things. And so this year they're researching the victims of the Victoria Day disaster. I think their project is due next week, so hopefully they've been working on that. And I can't wait to see what they come up with. And finally, our future directions, they're fairly simple. We want to continue on the ground that's already been broken at Woodland Cemetery by my former manager, Paul, by myself, and by all the students who've chosen to give their summers to local history here. This is my last year in London. I'll be moving away to do my master's degree next year. And my main goal right now is to find Western students who are interested in this sort of work and train them in how to work with our archives, as you can see in this picture. This is just one of our rooms of archives at Woodland Cemetery. Every piece of paperwork we've ever had dating back to the Victorian era, and just to keep this program going, and through that continue to be a repository of London's history and also a champion of the history of the Forest City, to make it real in ways that we often struggle to do. So I think we take a break now. Is that the order of the day?